You didn't fit in, not fully. There was always something slightly off about you. The way you asked too many questions, the way you saw problems differently, the way the group looked at you just a half second too long before looking away. You probably thought that was a personal flaw. But here is the thing. Every single civilization you have ever benefited from, fire, language, agriculture, the written word, the city you live in, was almost certainly built by someone the group didn't trust, someone who made people uncomfortable, someone who was, by every social standard of their time, an outcast. And the story of how that happened is far stranger than you were ever told. Go back far enough, not to ancient Greece or Mesopotamia. Go back to the African savanna. Your ancestors lived in tight bands of roughly 20 to 50 people. These were not casual social groups. They were survival units. Every member had a role. Every role had an expectation. And if you deviated from that expectation, the consequences were not embarrassment. They were death. Exile from the group in that environment was not a punishment. It was a sentence. Anthropologist Christopher Boehm spent decades studying what he called reverse dominance hierarchies in hunter-gatherer societies. What he found was striking. These early groups were obsessively, almost violently, egalitarian. Not because they were peaceful by nature, but because any single person who accumulated too much power, too much strange knowledge, too much individual identity was perceived as a direct threat to the group's survival. Documented how bands would gossip about the deviant, not for violence, for being too different. Think about what that means. For hundreds of thousands of years, your ancestors ran an active biological filter. The ones who conformed survived. The ones who didn't were removed from the gene pool. This should have produced a species of perfect, obedient conformists. And yet here you are, still asking too many questions, still feeling like something about the group doesn't quite make sense. Why? Because the filter had a flaw, and that flaw was geography. When a group became too large, it split. And sometimes the ones who split off were not the strongest or the most popular. They were the ones the group was quietly relieved to see go. The odd ones. The ones who hoarded strange berries nobody else would touch. The ones who talked to themselves. The ones who stared at the stars too long. Researchers like Kevin Lawland at the University of St. Andrews have described this as niche construction. The idea that certain individuals didn't just adapt to their environment, they changed it. And the ones most likely to change an environment were the ones who couldn't tolerate it as it was. These splinter groups didn't thrive immediately. Most of them died. The fossil record is not romantic. It is full of dead ends and collapsed experiments. But occasionally, rarely, and probably because conformist groups don't innovate, they optimize. There is a profound difference. Here is where it gets genuinely strange. Around 70,000 years ago, it is called the Great Leap Forward, though that name is contested now. Suddenly, in the archaeological record, you see art, you see jewelry, you see abstract symbols carved into ochre. You see tools of a complexity that had no precedent, and it doesn't appear everywhere at once. It appears in isolated pockets, small groups. Researcher Francesco Derrico has argued for years that these not a species-wide awakening. They were local experiments, and the groups running those experiments were not the dominant, well-fed. The outcasts were drawing on cave walls. Now here is the part your history classes never taught you. When those outcast groups discovered something extraordinary, absorbed back into larger groups, and the knowledge traveled with them. Sometimes they were conquered, and the knowledge was stolen. Sometimes they died with their secrets. But in the cases where the knowledge survived, it almost always did so because it was too useful to destroy, even if the person who carried it was too strange to fully accept. Agriculture is the most dramatic example. For years, the standard story was that farming was an obvious invention, a logical next step for a species tired of wandering. But archaeologist James C. Scott dismantled that early farming communities were by almost every measurable standard worse off than the hunter-gatherers around them. They were shorter. Hunter-gatherer groups knew this. They watched the farmers and largely refused to join them for thousands of years. Farming didn't spread because it was clearly better. It spread because the groups practicing it could sustain population densities that eventually overwhelmed groups who wouldn't adopt it and who started it. Not the successful, well-fed bands at the center of thriving ecosystems. The evidence points consistently toward marginal populations, groups living in zones where the old way was no longer working. Groups that had no choice but to try something nobody had tried before. Outcasts, again, people with nothing left to lose. This pattern does not stop at prehistory. It echoes through every era of human civilization in ways that are almost uncomfortable to trace. People their own societies considered dangerous. Socrates was executed. Spinoza was excommunicated. Galileo was imprisoned. Nikola Tesla died broke and alone. The list is not a coincidence. It is a structure. Societies are built by their conformists and guarded by them. But they are advanced by people the conformists didn't know what to do with. And your brain knows this dynamic intimately. Because you are not a neutral observer of this story. You are inside it right now. Psychologist Elaine Aron's research on what she called the highly sensitive person identified a subset of the population, roughly 15 to 20%. They are overwhelmed by crowds. They notice things others miss. They feel social friction more acutely. For decades, this was framed as a disorder, a deficit, a thing to be managed. But Aron's later work in the evolutionary biology that followed it suggested something different. This trait persisted because it was useful, not to the individual necessarily, to the group. Specifically to groups under pressure. In stable environments, the highly sensitive individual is a liability. Too slow, too cautious, too reactive. In novel, dangerous, rapidly changing environments, that same individual is the one most likely to notice the thing nobody else noticed. The thing that saves everyone. Evolution kept them around not despite how uncomfortable they made everyone else feel. Because of it. So, when you feel the particular loneliness of being slightly out of sync with the people around you, you are feeling something ancient. You are feeling the exact pressure that has been applied to a certain kind of human for 300,000 years. The pressure that said conform or be cast out. And with the fossil record, the archaeological evidence, and the behavioral data all converge to tell you is this. Who wandered to the margins and stared at the dark beyond the firelight a little longer than everyone else? Those are the ones who moved the entire species forward. You didn't fit in, not fully, and there is now 300,000 years of evidence suggesting that might be exactly the point.